I came home 2 days early from a business trip and found my daughter-in-law's mother locked outside on the back patio in a thunderstorm, soaked to the bone, unable to stand. I did not scream right away. I carried her inside, wrapped her in every blanket I could find, and once I understood what my own son had done, I made sure he spent the rest of his life regretting it. Before I go any further, let me know where you're watching from. Son or daughter, grandmother or grandfather, tell me in the comments. And if you believe that loyalty should never depend on how much money someone has left to give, hit like and subscribe right now. My name is Walter Grady. I'm 68 years old, and for 39 years I ran a commercial freight company out of a modest office park in Columbus, Ohio. I built that business from a single lease truck into a fleet of 42, and I did it the honest way, one contract at a time, one handshake at a time. My wife Eleanor passed 6 years ago from ovarian cancer, and after she was gone, the house felt too big and too quiet for a man who'd spent his whole life coming home to somebody. So when my son Bradley suggested that his mother-in-law, a woman named Ruth Hensley, move in with me instead of into some assisted living facility 2 states away, I said yes before he even finished the sentence. I want to explain who Ruth was to me, because it matters. Ruth wasn't my blood. She was my son's wife's mother, plain and simple. A woman I'd only really known for 6 years through holidays and birthday parties. But somewhere in that time, she became something more to me than an in-law. Ruth had been a school teacher for 31 years in a small town outside of Dayton. She'd raised her daughter Claire alone after her husband left when Claire was 9 years old. And she'd done it on a teacher's salary, clipping coupons and sewing her own curtains, and never once complaining about it. When Eleanor died, Ruth was the one who sat with me at the funeral reception when my own relatives had drifted off to refill their plates. She held my hand and told me that grief doesn't leave. It just learns to sit quietly in the corner of a room. I never forgot that. Ruth had a stroke 18 months ago, a moderate one, the kind that leaves you walking with a cane and slurring your words just slightly when you're tired, but doesn't take your mind or your independence. She recovered well, better than her doctors expected. But she couldn't safely live alone anymore, not with the stairs in her old house and nobody to call if she fell. Claire and Bradley were living in a 2-bedroom condo downtown and didn't have the space. I had a 5-bedroom colonial with a finished mother-in-law suite on the ground floor that Eleanor and I had built years ago for exactly this kind of situation, though we never imagined it would be Ruth who needed it. I offered without hesitation. Ruth cried when I told her. She said she didn't want to be a burden on anybody, least of all a man who wasn't even truly her family. I told her that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up. I meant every word of it. For the first year, it was good, better than good. Ruth and I settled into a rhythm that reminded me of the companionship I'd lost when Eleanor died. She made her famous chicken and dumplings on Sundays, and I taught her how to use the smart television. And in the evenings, we'd sit on the back porch with our coffee and talk about our children, our regrets, the strange comfort of growing old in a house that still had life in it. Bradley visited most weekends, always full of talk about his new real estate investment venture, always dressed a little sharper than the last time I'd seen him, always mentioning some new opportunity he was on the verge of closing. I love my son, but if I'm honest with myself now, looking back, I should have paid closer attention to how much that boy had started to care about appearances over substance. About 4 months ago, everything shifted. Bradley's investment venture collapsed. Some kind of over-leveraged property flip in Florida that went bad when the market cooled, and he came to me needing money, more money than I was comfortable giving outright. I told him I'd help him restructure, that I'd co-sign a modest loan through my business bank, but that I wouldn't hand him a blank check. He seemed to accept that, but something in his eyes changed that day. A coldness I hadn't seen in him before, not toward me, but toward the world in general, like he decided the rules that govern decent people no longer applied to him if they were standing between him and what he wanted. 3 weeks ago, I had to fly out to Denver for a logistics conference and a series of contract negotiations with a regional shipping partner. I told Ruth I'd be gone for 8 days. What I didn't tell anyone, not even Ruth, was that the negotiations wrapped up early and I decided to fly home Wednesday night instead of the following Monday. I wanted to surprise Ruth, and honestly, I wanted to surprise myself with a quiet weekend in my own house instead of a hotel room. I didn't call ahead. I took a cab from the airport in the middle of a violent late summer thunderstorm. Rain coming down so hard the wipers on the cab could barely keep up, lightning splitting the sky every few seconds. When the cab pulled into my driveway, I noticed Bradley's car parked out front, which struck me as strange for a Wednesday night. I paid the driver, grabbed my suitcase, and made a dash through the downpour to the front door. I let myself in with my key, and the house was dim, only a single lamp on in the living room. I could hear voices coming from somewhere near the back of the house. Laughter, the clink of glasses. I assumed Bradley and Claire had come over for dinner with Ruth, and I felt a small, warm flicker of happiness at the thought of walking in on my family gathered together. I set my suitcase down quietly, wanting to surprise them, and made my way toward the kitchen. But as I passed the sliding glass door that led out to the back patio, a flash of lightning illuminated something that stopped my heart cold. There was a shape huddled against the outer wall of the house, just beyond the overhang, exposed to the full fury of the storm. I pressed my face to the glass, and in the next flash of lightning, I saw her. Ruth, slumped against the brick, soaked completely through, her cane lying uselessly beside her on the wet concrete, her body shaking so violently I could see the tremor, even through the rain-streaked glass. I don't remember unlocking the sliding door. I don't remember crossing the patio. The next clear memory I have is kneeling beside her in the freezing rain, my dress shirt instantly soaked through, lifting her face toward mine. Her lips were a pale shade of blue. Her breathing was shallow and rattling. "Ruth," I said, and my voice came out cracked and broken in a way I didn't recognize. She opened her eyes halfway, and in a voice so faint I had to lean in to hear it over the storm, she said, "Walter, they locked the door. I've been out here so long. I'm so cold." How could they not hear her? How could anybody hear a 74-year-old woman screaming into a thunderstorm and simply choose not to listen? I scooped her up into my arms, cane and all, and carried her inside, laying her on the living room couch. I stripped off my soaked suit jacket and wrapped it around her, then grabbed every throw blanket in the house and piled them over her shivering frame. I turned the thermostat up as high as it would go, and then, as I knelt there rubbing warmth back into her ice-cold hands, I heard it again. The laughter. Coming from the kitchen. Loud, easy, unbothered laughter, like nothing in the world was wrong. I stood up, and something in me went very still and very quiet, the way the air goes still right before a tornado touches down. I walked toward that kitchen with my shirt still dripping onto the hardwood floor, and I pushed open the door. Bradley was sitting at my kitchen island with Claire, and across from them was a man I didn't immediately recognize. Someone Bradley later introduced as his new business partner, a slick younger man named Grant. There was a bottle of my aged Kentucky bourbon open on the counter, 3 glasses poured, and takeout containers from the expensive steakhouse downtown spread across my marble countertop. They were toasting to something. "What the hell is going on here?" I roared, and the sound of my own voice startled even me. Bradley's glass nearly slipped from his hand. "Dad," he stammered, his face draining of color, "you're supposed to be in Denver until Monday." I didn't answer him. I pointed a shaking finger back toward the living room. "Ruth is lying on my couch right now, half frozen, because somebody locked her outside in a thunderstorm," I said, my voice breaking on every word. "She could have died out there. How long has she been screaming for help while you 3 sat in here eating $50 steaks?" Bradley's face went through a rapid series of expressions. Shock, then something that looked disturbingly like calculation, before finally landing on a performance of horror. He said Ruth must have wandered outside on her own, that she does that sometimes, gets confused, and that they must not have heard her over the television. I looked at my son, a man I raised to tell the truth even when it cost him something, and I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like ice water, that he was lying to my face. The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later. Ruth was diagnosed with moderate hypothermia and a dangerously elevated heart rate from the physical stress of exposure. The doctor at the emergency room told me that if she'd been out there another 30 to 40 minutes, in her condition, with her cardiac history, she likely would not have survived the night. I sat in that hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, watching through a small window as nurses worked to stabilize a woman who wasn't even my blood relative, a woman who had shown me more genuine kindness in 18 months than my own son had shown me in the last 4, and something inside me that had always given people the benefit of the doubt simply switched off. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I've thought about it many times since. I did not confront Bradley that night with accusations. I did not demand answers. Something told me, some old instinct sharpened by decades of negotiating contracts with people who smiled while trying to take advantage of me, that if I showed my hand too early, I would only get excuses, tears, and a carefully rehearsed story. I needed the truth first. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I decided what to do about it. The next morning, while Ruth was still under observation at the hospital, I drove home and went straight to the small home office in the finished basement, the one place in the house with a security camera system I'd installed years ago after a string of package thefts in the neighborhood. I'd honestly forgotten it was even still running, an old habit from when Eleanor was alive and I traveled more than I should have. I pulled up the footage from the patio camera, the one angled toward the back door in the section of yard where Ruth had been found. What I watched over the next 20 minutes changed something fundamental in how I understood my own son. The footage showed Ruth, around 6:15 that evening, standing at the sliding glass door, knocking, clearly asking to be let back inside after sitting out on the patio, enjoying the evening air before the storm rolled in. I watched Bradley walk directly past that door, glance at her, and continue into the kitchen without opening it. I watched Claire do the same thing 11 minutes later. And then, at 6:41, just as the sky was beginning to darken and the first heavy drops of rain started falling, I watched Bradley walk to that same sliding door, look directly at Ruth's pleading face through the glass, and very deliberately turn the lock. I sat in that dim basement office and watched my son lock a defenseless, disabled 74-year-old woman outside in the beginning of a thunderstorm, and then walk away laughing at something his business partner had said. I watched the storm intensify over the next 90 minutes of footage. I watched Ruth bang on the glass repeatedly, her movements growing weaker and more desperate each time. I watched her eventually collapse against the outer wall, out of the direct line of the camera, but still visible at the edge of the frame, and simply stop moving except for the violent shivering. Nobody in that kitchen so much as glanced toward the door again until I walked through it myself. This was not an accident of neglect. This was not four young people too absorbed in conversation to notice an old woman outside. This was a decision, made in cold blood, by my own son, to leave a helpless woman exposed to a dangerous storm because she was, in his mind, simply in the way. I thought about why. I thought about the failed investment, the desperate need for money, and slowly, sickeningly, a theory began forming in my mind, one I needed to be certain of before I acted on it. I called my longtime attorney and closest friend, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Kowalski, who had handled every contract for my freight company for over 2 decades. I told her everything, the footage, the hospital, the lie Bradley told me. Diane went quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she asked me a question that cracked the whole thing open. She asked if Ruth had recently changed her will or her power of attorney. My stomach dropped, because I remembered, 3 weeks before I left for Denver, Bradley mentioning almost casually that he'd help Ruth get her financial paperwork organized since Claire was so busy with work, and that a family friend who happened to be a notary had come by the house to help finalize some updated documents. Diane told me to get her copies of everything, the will, the power of attorney, any financial documents Bradley might have had Ruth sign. It took 2 days of careful, quiet work, going through Ruth's small filing cabinet in the mother-in-law's suite while she was still recovering in the hospital, but what we found made my hands shake with rage. Ruth's original will had left the bulk of her modest but respectable estate, roughly $340,000 in savings, life insurance, and a paid-off rental property she owned outside Dayton, split evenly between Claire and Claire's younger brother, a quiet, decent man named Tom who lived in Michigan and rarely visited. The new documents, signed just 3 weeks earlier, granted Bradley durable power of attorney over all of Ruth's finances and named him as the sole executor and primary beneficiary of a newly created living trust, cutting Tom out entirely and reducing Claire's share to a token 10%. Ruth's signature was there, shaky, clearly the signature of someone recovering from a stroke, someone who trusted her son-in-law enough to sign whatever he told her needed signing, someone who almost certainly did not fully understand what she'd put her name to. I understood then exactly what I was looking at. My son had gotten Ruth to unknowingly sign over control of nearly her entire estate to him, and once that was locked in, Ruth herself had become an inconvenience, a slow-moving obstacle standing between Bradley and the moment he could access that money. Whether he had actually planned for her to die that night in the storm, or whether he simply stopped caring what happened to her once the paperwork was signed, I honestly do not know to this day, and I'm not certain it matters. The result would have been the same either way. I sat with Diane in her office that Friday afternoon, and I told her I did not want to simply call the police and have Bradley arrested for elder abuse, though God knows he deserved it. I wanted something more complete. I wanted the fraudulent documents exposed and voided in court. I wanted Tom to get what was rightfully his mother's intention. And I wanted Bradley to understand, in front of everyone whose opinion he'd spent his whole life chasing, exactly what kind of man he had become. Diane looked at me for a long moment and said that building an airtight case for elder financial abuse and fraud, one that would hold up against a son who clearly had some legal sophistication, would take patience. She told me I could not let Bradley know that I suspected anything. I had to go back to playing the confused, guilty, grateful father who believed his son's lie about Ruth wandering outside on her own. So that's exactly what I did. I drove back to the hospital that evening and found Bradley and Claire in the family waiting area, and I let my shoulders sag with genuine-looking exhaustion. I told Bradley I was sorry for yelling at him, that I'd been scared and irrational, that of course I understood accidents happen, and that Ruth sometimes wandered when she got confused. I watched relief flood across my son's face, watched the tension drain out of his shoulders, and I felt something cold settle permanently in my chest. He believed he'd gotten away with it. He believed his careful lie had worked. He hugged me and thanked me for understanding, and I hugged him back and forced myself not to think about the footage of him turning that lock. Over the following 3 weeks, Diane's team of forensic accountants and a retired elder law specialist she brought in built a case methodically and quietly. They subpoenaed the notary who'd witnessed the new trust documents. And it turned out he wasn't a neutral family friend at all. He was a business associate of Grant's, the same slick partner I'd seen drinking bourbon in my kitchen. And he had a prior formal complaint on his notary license for improperly witnessing signatures on documents involving a cognitively impaired client. They pulled medical records showing Ruth had been prescribed a new medication just 5 days before signing the trust, one with documented side effects including confusion and impaired judgment, information Bradley absolutely knew because he'd picked up that prescription from the pharmacy himself. Meanwhile, I let Bradley believe everything was normal. I even let him talk me into loaning him an additional $20,000 for what he called a bridge loan on a new property deal. Money I fully expected never to see again and didn't particularly want back because every dollar he took, every confident smile he gave me while lying to my face, was simply more rope for the noose he was building for himself. Ruth recovered slowly at the hospital and then in a short-term rehabilitation facility, and every single day I visited her, and every single day she asked me nervously if Bradley was upset with her for wandering outside. It broke something in me each time, watching her carry guilt for a crime that had been committed against her. 3 weeks after the storm, Diane told me we were ready. She'd arranged a meeting at her law office, framed to Bradley and Claire as a routine family estate planning session now that Ruth was recovering, and everyone wanted, quote, peace of mind for the future. Bradley showed up wearing one of his sharpest suits, practically glowing with confidence, clearly expecting to sit in that room and have his fraudulent trust quietly formalized and rubber-stamped with nobody the wiser. Claire came too, looking uncertain but trusting her husband completely. I made sure Tom flew in from Michigan the night before, staying at my house, kept completely out of sight until the meeting itself. I want to describe walking into that conference room because it is one of the moments I will remember most clearly for the rest of my life. Bradley strolled in first, all easy charm, shaking Diane's hand, cracking a joke about lawyers charging by the hour, even for family matters. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Tom sitting at the far end of the table. His smile flickered, just slightly, like a light bulb about to burn out. Then he saw the retired elder law specialist, a stern, gray-haired woman named Marilyn who Diane introduced simply by her full professional title. Then he saw the folder sitting squarely in the middle of the table, thick, official, with the notary's name printed on a sticky tab along the side. Diane didn't waste time on pleasantries. She opened that folder and laid out piece by piece exactly what her investigation had uncovered. The prescription records, the notary's disciplinary history, and his financial ties to Grant. Bank statements showing Bradley had already transferred $11,000 out of Ruth's primary savings account into an account solely in his own name in the 2 weeks after the trust was signed. Money meant, according to the withdrawal memos he'd written himself, for, quote, mother's care expenses, despite Ruth still living entirely under my roof with all her expenses covered by me. And finally, the security footage. Diane played it on a laptop set up at the head of the table, and I watched my son's face as he watched himself, in high definition, turn that lock and walk away. I have negotiated hundreds of contracts in my life, watched grown men bluff and posture and try to talk their way out of a bad position, but I have never seen a human being's composure collapse the way Bradley's did in that room. He stammered that it wasn't what it looked like, that Ruth had said she wanted to stay outside a little longer, that he genuinely thought the storm would pass before it got bad. Claire, watching that footage of her own mother collapsing in the rain while her husband walked past her not once but twice, made a sound I can only describe as wounded, an animal sound of pure grief and betrayal, and she stood up from that table and walked out of the room without saying another word to Bradley. Marilyn, the elder law specialist, informed Bradley calmly and clearly that the trust documents would be immediately challenged in probate court on the grounds of undue influence and lack of capacity, that the $11,000 he'd already taken constituted felony elder financial exploitation under Ohio law, and that given the medical evidence of Ruth's hypothermia and the footage clearly showing intentional confinement, the county prosecutor's elder abuse unit would very likely be pursuing separate criminal charges as well. Bradley looked at me then, and for just a moment, I saw something like the boy I used to know, scared and desperate, asking me silently to fix it, to make it go away, the way I always had. I did not fix it. I told him, calmly, that I had spent 39 years building a business on the principle that a man's word and a man's honor are the only things he truly owns, and that I no longer recognized the man sitting across from me as someone who understood that principle at all. I told him that Ruth had shown me more kindness and integrity in 18 months under my roof than he had shown anyone in years, and that I would not lift a single finger to protect him from the consequences of what he had chosen to do to her. The following weeks unfolded exactly as Marilyn had predicted. The county prosecutor's office, presented with the security footage and the medical timeline, charged Bradley with felony endangerment of an elderly adult and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. He avoided prison through a plea agreement, largely because of his lack of a prior record, but he was sentenced to 5 years of probation, mandatory restitution of every dollar he'd taken, 300 hours of community service, and a permanent restraining order, preventing him from having any contact with Ruth whatsoever. The fraudulent trust was fully voided by the probate court, and Ruth's original will, splitting her estate fairly between Claire and Tom, was reinstated and formally protected. Claire filed for divorce 2 months later. She told me, sitting on my back porch with tears in her eyes, that she couldn't unsee the footage of her husband walking past her own mother's pleading face, not once, but twice, and that she didn't know if she could ever trust that he hadn't simply been waiting for her mother to die. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, that the sins of a husband are not inherited by a wife, and that she and Tom would always have a place in this family. In my family, regardless of what happened between her and my son, Ruth still lives with me. She's stronger now, physically and in some ways emotionally too, though I know the memory of that storm and that locked door will never fully leave her. We've settled back into our old rhythm, the Sunday dinners, the evening coffee on the porch, though now Claire joins us most weekends too, and Tom flies down every couple of months, and slowly, quietly, a new kind of family has assembled itself out of the wreckage of the old one. Bradley reached out to me once, about 4 months after his sentencing, asking if we could talk, if there was any way back from this. I told him the door was not permanently closed, that I still loved him as my son and always would, but that trust, once shattered this completely, has to be rebuilt slowly, through years of consistent honesty, not through a single conversation over coffee. He hasn't reached out since. I think about that night in the storm often, kneeling on the wet concrete, with Ruth's frozen hands in mine, and I think about how close I came to walking through that front door 2 days early, and simply going to bed without checking the back patio, without ever knowing what my own son had done. I think about how many families never get that moment of accidental, brutal clarity, how many quiet betrayals happen behind locked doors with nobody there to see them. Last week, Ruth and I sat out on that same back porch, the same spot where I found her broken and shivering months earlier, and she reached over and squeezed my hand and told me that I had given her something her own daughter's husband tried to take away, which was simply the right to grow old with dignity, surrounded by people who actually cared whether she lived or died. I told her that family isn't about the blood in your veins. It never was. It's about who opens the door when the storm comes, and who, God forbid, locks it instead. We sat there until the sun went down, two people who weren't supposed to belong to each other, exactly where we both belonged.